You think you are in control. You believe your life is shaped by your goals, your plans, your intelligence. You think you are moving forward, slowly, maybe imperfectly, but still in control. But if you are honest, brutally honest, there are moments where you lose control so easily that it should scare you. A single sentence said in anger, and a relationship shifts. A single emotional reaction, and an opportunity disappears. A single careless decision with money, and months of effort quietly vanish. And the worst part is, you call it normal. You say things like, I was just being honest. I was just not in the mood. It's just a small expense. But those moments are not small. They are patterns. And those patterns are shaping your entire life. I remember a moment that hit me harder than I expected. I was in a conversation, nothing serious, just a normal exchange. But something triggered me, a small comment, and before I even realized it, I responded. Not thoughtfully, not intentionally, emotionally. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew. That wasn't control. That was reaction. And in that moment, I saw something clearly. I wasn't deciding how I lived. I was reacting my way through life. Now pause here, because this is where most people refuse to look. You don't lose your life in big, dramatic failures. You lose it in small, repeated moments where you are not in control. Your mouth speaks before your mind thinks. Your mood decides before your values do. Your money leaves before you question it. And over time, those small losses compound, until one day you look at your life and wonder why things feel off. Even though nothing big went wrong, but something did go wrong. You were never in control to begin with. Now here is the uncomfortable truth. Winning in life is not about doing more. It is about losing less. Less unnecessary words, less emotional reactions, less careless decisions. Because every time you fail to control these three things, you give away power. Power over your relationships, power over your direction, power over your future. And once that power is gone, it doesn't come back easily. There was a man I once heard about named Andrew. Smart, capable, driven. But he had one problem he never took seriously. He reacted. In meetings, he would speak too quickly. In conflict, he would escalate instead of pause. With money, he would spend to relieve stress. Individually, none of these seemed catastrophic, but together, they defined him. And not in the way he wanted, because people didn't see his intelligence. They saw his lack of control, and that cost him more than he realized. Now think about this carefully. How many times have you said something and immediately wished you hadn't? How many times have you acted based on how you felt and paid for it later? How many times have you spent money not because you needed to, but because you wanted to feel something different? Because those moments, they are not accidents. They are evidence. Evidence of a mind that has not been trained. And an untrained mind will always default to reaction, not intention. So here is where everything begins. Not with motivation, not with a plan, but with awareness. You have to see it clearly, without excuses, without softening the truth. Because once you see how often you lose control, you can no longer pretend it's not happening. And that awareness is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Because the moment you become aware, you create a gap, a small space between what happens and how you respond. And that space is where control lives. Right now, that space is too small, almost invisible. That's why you react. That's why you lose. But over the next parts, you are going to expand that space. You are going to learn how to pause before speaking, how to detach before reacting, how to think before spending. Not perfectly, but intentionally. Because once you stop reacting, you stop losing. And once you stop losing, you start winning. Not occasionally, but consistently. And in the next part, you're going to see why even strong people lose control, and how those small reactions quietly destroy everything they build. There is a dangerous illusion that strong people believe. They think control comes from strength, that if you are intelligent enough, disciplined enough, experienced enough, you won't lose control in small moments. But that's not how it works, because control is not tested when things are easy. It is tested in the exact moment you feel triggered, and in that moment, strength means nothing if it is not trained. I used to think that if I understood enough, I would naturally act better. That awareness alone would protect me, that once I knew better, I would automatically do better. But I was wrong, because there were still moments where I reacted instantly, moments where I said something sharp without thinking, moments where my mood shifted and my behavior followed it blindly, moments where I made decisions with money, not based on logic, but based on emotion. And every time it felt the same, fast, automatic, almost out of my control. Now pause here, because this is where the real problem begins to reveal itself. You are not reacting because you are weak. You are reacting because you are untrained. There is a difference. Weakness is a lack of ability. Untrained is a lack of conditioning. And most people are simply untrained in controlling themselves. There was a man named Victor who had everything on paper. Smart, educated, capable. He could plan, analyze, think deeply. But in real situations, he kept losing, not in obvious ways, but in small, repeated ones. In meetings when challenged, he would defend himself too quickly, instead of listening. In conversations when irritated, his tone would shift, even if his words didn't. With money, when stressed, he would justify spending just to feel temporary relief. And here's what made it worse. He knew all of this. He was aware, but awareness didn't stop the reaction, because awareness without training changes nothing. Now think about that. How many times have you told yourself, I shouldn't have said that? How many times have you realized, after the moment, that you overreacted? How many times have you looked at a decision and thought, that wasn't smart, but only after it was already done? That's not a lack of knowledge. That's a lack of control in real time. And real time is where your life is decided. Now here is the deeper truth. Your brain is designed to react fast, faster than your logic, faster than your intention. Because in the past, speed meant survival. But today, that same speed is costing you. Because reacting fast might protect you physically, but it destroys you socially, emotionally, and financially. So if you don't train your mind, it will default to reaction. Every time. Victor didn't change when he learned more. He changed when he started practicing something uncomfortable. He slowed down, not in life, but in response. When someone challenged him, he paused. When he felt irritated, he stayed silent for a moment longer than usual. When he wanted to spend impulsively, he waited. And at first, it felt unnatural, almost like he was holding himself back. But what he was actually doing was creating space. That same space you felt in part one. The space between stimulus and response. Now here's the key. That space does not exist naturally. You have to build it. And you build it through repetition, through small intentional pauses, through catching yourself in the moment, not after, in the moment. Because once the reaction is out, it's too late. The damage is already done. So the goal is not to become perfect. The goal is to become aware early enough to intervene. Now let me ask you something. What is the first thing you do when you feel triggered? Do you speak? Do you react? Do you justify? Or do you pause? Because that one difference is separating the version of you that loses control from the version of you that wins in every situation. And once you start practicing that pause, something powerful begins to happen. You stop being controlled by the moment. You start controlling how the moment affects you. And that is where real power begins. Because in the next part, you're going to see how something as simple as your words can quietly destroy or transform your entire life. There is a sentence that can cost you years of progress, not because of what it says, but because of when you say it, and more importantly, how. Most people think their words are harmless, that speaking freely is a sign of confidence, that saying what's on your mind makes you real. But here is the truth. Most people don't speak to create results. They speak to release emotion. And that difference changes everything. I remember a conversation that stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't even intense, but there was a moment, a small moment, where I felt slightly disrespected. Not enough to matter, but enough to react. And without thinking, I responded. My words were not loud, they were not aggressive, but they carried something underneath. Tension. And the moment I said it, I felt the shift. The energy changed. The conversation changed. The perception of me changed. Now pause here, because this is where most people don't realize what's happening. It's not always what you say. It's the state you say it from. You can say the right words in the wrong tone and lose. You can say something small at the wrong time and lose. You can say something unnecessary just to release a feeling and lose. Because every time you speak without control, you reveal your state. And people don't just hear your words, they feel your lack of discipline. There was a man named Daniel who had great ideas. Smart, articulate, capable. But in meetings, he had a habit. He spoke too quickly. Whenever something came to mind, he said it. Whenever he disagreed, he responded immediately. Whenever he felt the need to prove a point, he jumped in. And at first glance, it looked like confidence. But over time, it became a problem. Because people didn't see him as thoughtful. They saw him as reactive. And that one trait limited his growth more than he realized. Now think about this carefully. How many times have you spoken just to fill silence? How many times have you responded just to defend yourself? How many times have you said something not because it needed to be said, but because you felt something inside that needed to come out? Because that is where control is lost. Not in big speeches, but in small, unnecessary words. Now here is the deeper layer. Talking too much is not a communication problem. It is an emotional problem. It means you are not comfortable holding tension. You are not comfortable being misunderstood. You are not comfortable staying silent when something inside you wants to react. So you speak, not to improve the situation, but to relieve yourself. And that relief costs you. Now let me show you the shift. Control is not about saying less randomly. It is about saying less intentionally. Before you speak, you ask one question. Is this necessary, or is this emotional? That question alone will change how you communicate, because most of what you say is not necessary. It is reactive. Daniel didn't become more respected by speaking more. He became more respected by pausing, by listening longer, by choosing his words instead of releasing them. And at first, it felt uncomfortable, because silence creates pressure. It makes you feel exposed. But that pressure is where control is built. Now here's something most people never notice. The person who speaks less often has more power. Not because they are quieter, but because when they do speak, it carries weight. Because it is intentional, not impulsive. Now ask yourself this. When you speak, are you trying to create an outcome, or are you trying to release a feeling? Because those two lead to completely different lives. One builds respect, the other leaks control. And once you see that clearly, you start to change. Not dramatically, but deliberately. You start catching yourself before speaking. You start holding back when it's not necessary. You start choosing silence when your emotions are loud. And that is where your power begins to return. Because controlling your mouth is not about saying nothing. It is about making sure that when you do speak, it serves you, not your emotions. And in the next part, you're going to face something even more difficult. Because controlling your words is one thing. Controlling your mood is something most people never learn. Your mood feels like who you are. That's the illusion. You wake up feeling heavy, and suddenly everything looks harder. You feel irritated, and people seem more annoying. You feel unmotivated, and your goals start to feel distant, almost unrealistic. And without realizing it, you start adjusting your behavior to match your mood. You slow down, you delay, you disengage. And it feels justified. Because in your mind, this is just how I feel today. But here is the truth most people never confront. Your mood is not your identity. It is a temporary state that you've learned to obey. I remember a period where my days were completely controlled by how I felt. If I woke up energized, I was productive. If I felt low, I would do less. If something annoyed me, my entire day would shift. And at the time, it felt normal, human even. But slowly, something started to bother me. My consistency was unstable, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I kept changing based on how I felt. And that's when I saw it. I wasn't living based on standards. I was living based on moods. Now pause here, because this is where most people stay stuck for years. They believe that emotional alignment must come before action. I need to feel better before I can do this. I'll start when I'm in the right mindset. I just need to get my mood right. But what if that never happens? What if your mood is always shifting, always unstable, always unpredictable? Then your life becomes the same, unstable, inconsistent, reactive. There was a woman named Sophia who struggled with this deeply. She wasn't lazy, she wasn't unmotivated. In fact, she cared a lot about improving her life. But her actions were always tied to how she felt. On good days, she was unstoppable. On bad days, she disappeared. And over time, those bad days started to dominate. Not because there were more of them, but because she gave them more control. Now let's go deeper. Inside you, there are two forces constantly interacting: your emotional state and your chosen standard. Your emotional state says, I don't feel like it. Your standard says, this is what we do. And in every moment, one of them wins. For most people, emotions win, not because they are stronger, but because they are louder. They feel real, immediate, urgent. But standards? They are quiet. They require discipline. They require decision. And that's why most people ignore them. Sophia didn't change when she tried to fix her mood. She changed when she stopped giving it authority. When she felt tired, she acted anyway. When she felt unmotivated, she followed through anyway. When she felt off, she stayed consistent anyway. And at first, it felt wrong, almost like she was going against herself. But she wasn't. She was separating herself from her mood. Now here's the shift. You are not your emotions. You are the one observing them. And once you understand that, you stop obeying them blindly. You start questioning them. Just because I feel this, does it mean I have to act on it? And most of the time, the answer is no. Now understand this clearly. This is not about suppressing your emotions. It's about not letting them dictate your behavior. Because emotions will always fluctuate, but your standards, those can remain stable. Now imagine this. Instead of asking, how do I feel today? You ask, what does my standard require today? That one shift changes everything because it removes the instability. It removes the excuses. It removes the dependency on something you cannot control and replaces it with something you can. Your decision. Now ask yourself this. How many times have you allowed your mood to decide your day? How many opportunities have you delayed just because you didn't feel like it? Because those moments are costing you more than you realize, not just in results, but in identity. Every time you obey your mood, you reinforce the idea that you are controlled by it. But every time you act despite it, you take that control back. And slowly, you become someone different. Not someone who always feels good, but someone who moves regardless. And that is far more powerful, because in the next part, you're going to confront something even more revealing. Because money doesn't just show what you have, it shows who you are when no one is watching. Money is the most honest mirror you will ever face. It doesn't care about what you say. It doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about who you think you are. It only shows what you actually do. And that's why most people avoid looking at it too closely. Because when you do, you start to see patterns that are hard to ignore. I remember a time when I told myself I was trying to be better with money. I said I was more aware, more responsible, more intentional. But when I looked at my actual spending, it told a different story. Small purchases, that didn't matter. Impulse decisions that felt justified in the moment. Little rewards after stressful days. Nothing extreme, nothing dramatic, but enough to quietly drain progress. Now pause here, because this is where the truth becomes uncomfortable. You don't lose money in big mistakes. You lose it in small, repeated decisions that feel harmless. A coffee you didn't need. Something you bought because you were bored. A purchase you made just to feel better for a moment. And each one feels insignificant. But over time, they reveal something deeper, a lack of control. Not over money, over yourself. There was a man named Jason who earned well. Stable income, good opportunities. From the outside, everything looked fine. But he always felt behind. Always felt like he wasn't moving forward financially. And he couldn't understand why. Until one day, he tracked everything. Not just the big expenses, everything. And what he saw changed how he viewed himself. It wasn't one big mistake. It was dozens of small ones. Daily, unnoticed, unquestioned. And each one had a reason. I deserve this. It's not that much. I'll save more later. But those reasons were just emotional justifications. Now think about that. How often do you spend money? Not because you need to, but because you feel something? Bored, stressed, tired, unfocused. Because money is not just a financial tool. It is an emotional outlet. And if you don't control your emotions, your money will follow them. Now here is the deeper layer. Spending is not about the amount. It is about the decision behind it. Two people can spend the same money, but from completely different states. One spends intentionally, the other spends reactively. And over time, their lives look completely different. Jason didn't become better with money by earning more. He became better by pausing. Before every non-essential purchase, he asked one question. Is this a decision or a reaction? And that question changed everything. Because most of the time, it was a reaction. And once he saw that clearly, he started stopping himself. Not always, but more often. And that was enough. Because control doesn't come from perfection. It comes from awareness applied in real time. Now here's something most people never admit. Financial problems are rarely about income. They are about behavior. Because if you cannot control small amounts, you will not control large ones. The pattern stays the same. Only the scale changes. Now ask yourself this. If your current spending habits stayed exactly the same for the next 5 years, where would you end up? Not where you hope, not where you plan, but where your behavior is actually taking you. Because that answer is your reality. And once you see it clearly, you have a choice. Continue reacting or start deciding. Because every time you pause before spending, you are not just saving money. You are building discipline. You are reinforcing control. You are becoming someone who doesn't let emotion decide their direction. And that is far more valuable than money itself. Because in the next part, you're going to learn how to build that pause intentionally, not just with money, but in every area of your life. So that instead of reacting, you start choosing. Most people think control is about being stronger. Stronger willpower, stronger discipline, stronger resistance. But that's not how real control is built. Because strength fails under pressure. What you actually need is space. A space between what happens and what you do next. Right now, that space is too small, almost invisible. That's why you react. Someone says something, you respond instantly. You feel something, you act immediately. You want something, you take it without thinking. No gap, no control, just reaction. I didn't understand this until I started noticing how fast everything was happening inside me. The trigger, the emotion, the action, all blended into one. There was no moment to choose. And that's when I realized something simple. If I wanted control, I had to slow down the moment, not life. The moment. There was a technique I came across that sounded almost too simple to matter. Pause. Just pause. Not for minutes, not for long. Just a few seconds. And at first, it felt pointless. What can a few seconds change? Everything. Because those few seconds create awareness. And awareness creates choice. Let me show you how this works. Step 1. You notice the trigger, not after, not later. In real time, someone interrupts you. You feel irritation rising. That's the moment. Step 2. You don't act. You pause. Even if it's just one breath, even if it feels awkward, you hold. And in that pause, something powerful happens. The emotion is still there. But now you are aware of it, not controlled by it. Step 3. You decide. Not based on impulse, but based on intention. What response actually serves me here? And that question only exists because you paused. Now here's the key. This is not natural. You have to train it. At first, you will forget. You will react. You will realize after. That's fine, because even that awareness is progress. Then slowly you start catching it earlier, mid-reaction, then right before. And eventually, you catch it at the exact moment it begins. And that's when control becomes real. There was a man named Leo who practiced this in a way that changed his entire presence. He wasn't louder, he wasn't more aggressive. He didn't try to dominate situations. He just paused. Before speaking, before reacting, before deciding. And people noticed something different. Not because he said more, but because nothing about him felt rushed. He was intentional, measured, in control. Now think about that. The person who reacts fast looks emotional. The person who pauses looks powerful. Not because they are better, but because they are trained. Now here is something deeper. That pause is not just about control. It is about identity. Because every time you pause and choose your response, you are reinforcing a new version of yourself. Someone who doesn't react. Someone who decides. And that identity compounds. Across conversations. Across emotions. Across decisions. Until one day, you realize something has changed. You are no longer being pulled by every situation. You are moving through them with control, with awareness, with intention. Now ask yourself this. When was the last time you paused? Before reacting, not after. Before. Because that moment is where your future is decided. And in the next part, you're going to see what happens when you master this. When you stop reacting completely and start operating from a place most people never reach. There is a moment where everything becomes quiet. Not outside, inside. It doesn't happen because life gets easier. It doesn't happen because people stop challenging you. It doesn't happen because problems disappear. It happens because you stop reacting. I remember noticing it for the first time in a situation that would normally trigger me. A conversation that in the past would have pulled me into defending, explaining, proving something. The trigger was there. I felt it. But something was different. There was space. And in that space, I didn't react. I listened. I chose. And when I responded, it wasn't emotional. It was intentional. And that moment felt powerful. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just controlled. Now pause here. Because this is what most people misunderstand about winning. Winning is not about dominating situations. It is about not losing yourself inside them. Because every time you react impulsively, you lose position. You lose clarity. You lose control. But when you stop reacting, you gain something most people never develop. Composure. And composure is a silent advantage. There was a man named Marcus who built his entire reputation on this one trait. Not because he was the smartest in the room, not because he spoke the most, but because in moments where others reacted, he remained steady. When tension rose, he slowed down. When others spoke quickly, he waited. When emotions escalated, he stayed neutral. And over time, people trusted him more, respected him more, listened to him more, not because he forced it, but because he never lost control. Now think about that. In a world where most people react instantly, the one who doesn't stands out immediately, not by doing more, but by doing less. Less reacting, less speaking without thinking, less emotional leakage. And that difference changes everything. Because when you stop reacting, you start seeing clearly. You start understanding situations instead of being pulled into them. You start choosing responses that move you forward instead of ones that just release tension. Now here is where it gets deeper. When you no longer react, people can't control you. They can't trigger you easily. They can't manipulate your emotions because your response is no longer automatic. It is chosen, and that makes you dangerous in the best way. Not aggressive, not dominant, but unshakable. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you lost not because you were wrong, but because you reacted the wrong way? How many situations could have gone differently if you had just paused? Because that is the difference. Not intelligence, not opportunity, control. Marcus didn't win every situation, but he never lost himself in one. And that consistency built everything else. Now here's the shift. You don't need to control every situation. You need to control yourself in every situation. Because once you do that, the outcome becomes secondary. You are no longer dependent on what happens. You are defined by how you respond. And that is real power. Now imagine living like that, where your words are intentional. Your emotions are observed, not obeyed. Your decisions are chosen, not triggered. That is not perfection. That is training. And once that training becomes part of you, you stop reacting your way through life. You start leading yourself through it. And in the next part, everything becomes undeniable, because you will see the difference between people who react and people who are trained to win. There is a difference you can feel before you can explain it. You meet two people. One reacts fast, speaks quickly, defends instantly, explains everything. You can almost predict what they will say next because they are being pulled by the moment. The other is different. They listen longer. They pause. They don't rush to fill silence. And when they speak, it lands. Not because they say something extraordinary, but because it is controlled. Now here is what most people miss. The difference is not personality. It is training. Because the people who win consistently are not calmer by nature. They are conditioned to not react. I used to think composure was something you either had or didn't, that some people were just naturally cool under pressure. But the more I observed, the more I realized something else. They weren't calm. They were practiced. They had trained themselves to not give in to the first impulse, and that changes everything. There was a situation I watched once between two colleagues. A disagreement, nothing major, but it escalated quickly for one of them. His voice got sharper. His tone changed. His words became faster. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was reacting. And the more he reacted, the more he lost control. Now here's the shift. The other person didn't fight back. He didn't match the energy. He didn't try to win the argument in the moment. He slowed down. He asked one question, then waited. And that pause changed the entire direction of the conversation. Because when one person stops reacting, the dynamic breaks. Now pause here, because this is where real power becomes visible. The person who reacts is predictable. The person who pauses is in control. And control always wins in the long run. Now let's go deeper. Most people think winning is about having better arguments, better ideas, better strategies. But in reality, winning often comes down to one thing: who loses control first? Because the moment you react emotionally, you give up your position. You stop thinking clearly. You start defending instead of deciding. And that shift costs you in conversations, in relationships, in opportunities. Now here is something uncomfortable. You don't lose because others are better. You lose because you lose control at the wrong moment. And those moments are everywhere. A comment that triggers you, a situation that frustrates you, a decision that pressures you. And in each one, you either react or you respond. That difference is everything. There was a woman named Elena who struggled with this for years. She was capable, intelligent, driven, but in moments of pressure, she would react, not aggressively, but emotionally. She would over-explain, defend too quickly, try to fix things immediately, and it cost her, not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. People didn't fully trust her judgment, not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't steady. Now here's what changed. She started practicing one thing, not reacting immediately. When something triggered her, she waited, just a few seconds longer than usual. And in that small delay, she gained something she never had before: choice. And that choice changed how people saw her, not because she became someone else, but because she stopped showing the reactive version of herself. Now think about this. If you could remove just one thing from your behavior, your impulsive reactions, how different would your life look? How many situations would improve? How many mistakes would disappear? Because that's the reality. Most of your problems are not caused by lack of knowledge. They are caused by lack of control in the moment. Now here is the final shift of this part. Winning is not about always being right. It is about never losing yourself. Because once you can hold your state, no situation can control you. No person can trigger you easily. No moment can pull you out of alignment. And that is what separates people who drift from people who decide. Because in the next part, everything comes together, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as a standard, a way of living, where control is no longer something you try to have. It becomes something you are. There is a version of you that still negotiates. Not loudly, not obviously, but quietly, in small moments. You tell yourself you've changed, that you're more aware now, that you pause more, that you think before you act. And maybe you do, sometimes. But then there are those moments, subtle, quick, easy to ignore, where you still let something slip. You say something you didn't need to say. You react slightly faster than you should have. You make a small decision, not because it was right, but because it felt easier. And in that moment, you go back. Not fully, but enough. Now pause here, because this is where most people misunderstand control. They think control is about big wins, big discipline, big changes. But real control is tested in the smallest moments, the ones no one sees, the ones you could easily justify, the ones where it would be so easy to say, it doesn't matter. But it does, because those small moments are the final layer, the difference between someone who is improving and someone who is fully in control. I remember reaching this stage and thinking I had it figured out. I was more aware, I paused more, I reacted less. But then I noticed something uncomfortable. I was still negotiating in subtle ways, not with big things, with small ones. I would catch myself thinking, this doesn't really matter. This is not a big deal. I can let this one go. And that's when I saw it clearly. The pattern wasn't gone. It had just become quieter, more refined, more dangerous. Because now it was harder to notice. There was a man named Victor who experienced this exact phase. He had already built discipline, already improved his reactions, already gained control in most situations. But he still had gaps, small ones, moments where he would slightly lower his standards, not enough to fail, but enough to stay limited. And that's when he made a decision that changed everything. He stopped negotiating completely, not just with big actions, with small ones. If something didn't need to be said, he didn't say it. If a reaction wasn't necessary, he didn't express it. If a decision wasn't aligned, he didn't make it. No exceptions. Now this is where it gets uncomfortable, because this level of control feels extreme. It feels rigid. It feels like you're holding yourself to a higher standard than most people around you. And that's exactly why most people never reach it. They stop at better, but better still leaves room for mistakes, still leaves room for reaction, still leaves room for inconsistency. Victor didn't want to be better. He wanted to be in control, fully. And that required something most people avoid: zero tolerance for his old patterns. Now let's go deeper. At this level, you are no longer fighting big impulses. You are refining small ones. The tone in your voice, the timing of your response, the intention behind your decisions. Everything becomes precise, not because you are forcing it, but because you have trained yourself to notice. And once you notice, You can't ignore it. Now think about this. What if you removed every unnecessary reaction from your life? Not most. Every. What if you only spoke when it added value? What if you only acted when it was intentional? What if you stopped giving yourself permission to slip, even slightly? Because that is where the real transformation happens, not in becoming disciplined, but in becoming precise. And precision creates power. Now ask yourself this. Where are you still allowing small things to slide? Where are you still saying it's not a big deal? Because that is exactly where your next level is. And in the final part, everything becomes clear. Because you are no longer building control. You are becoming someone who naturally has it. There is a point where control stops being something you practice and starts becoming something you are. It doesn't feel dramatic. There is no moment where everything suddenly changes. No switch, no breakthrough, just a quiet realization that you no longer react the way you used to. I remember noticing it in the simplest situation. Someone said something that in the past would have triggered me instantly, not in a big way, just enough to shift my tone, my energy, my response. But this time, nothing happened. Not because I suppressed it, not because I forced control, but because there was no impulse to react. And that's when I understood something that most people never reach. Real control is not about holding yourself back. It's about no longer needing to. Now pause here, because this is the final shift. At the beginning, everything required effort. You had to remind yourself to pause. You had to catch your words. You had to question your emotions. You had to stop yourself from reacting. It felt heavy, unnatural, almost exhausting. But over time, those actions became automatic, not the reactions, the control. And that is the difference. You are no longer fighting your impulses. You have trained your impulses. There is a version of you now that doesn't speak just to release emotion, that doesn't act just because something was triggered, that doesn't spend just to feel better, because those patterns have been replaced, not by force, but by repetition. Now here is the truth. Most people never get here, not because it's impossible, but because they stop too early. They reach a level where they are better, and they settle. They still react sometimes, still speak unnecessarily, still make emotional decisions, but they accept it, because it's less than before. But less is not control. Less is still inconsistency, and inconsistency always finds a way back. Now think about this carefully. If you only lose control 10% of the time, those moments will still cost you. In the wrong conversation, at the wrong time, in the wrong decision. Because life doesn't punish you for what you do most of the time. It punishes you for what you do at the wrong time. And that's why this final level matters. Because here, you remove that risk. You remove the version of you that reacts, not by suppressing it, but by outgrowing it. Now let's bring everything together. You learn to pause before speaking. You learn to separate yourself from your mood. You learn to question your decisions before acting. You learn to control your environment. You learn to remove unnecessary reactions. You learn to stop negotiating. And over time, those became your default, not something you try to do, something you naturally do. Now understand this. You are not becoming someone new. You are removing everything that was uncontrolled, everything that was reactive, everything that was automatic. And what remains is clarity, precision, control. Now ask yourself this. If you lived like this every day, if every word was intentional, if every emotion was observed, if every decision was chosen, what would your life look like in a year? Because that version of you is not far away. It is built moment by moment, decision by decision, pause by pause. And the truth is, you don't need more time. You don't need more knowledge. You don't need a better situation. You need a higher standard. A standard where you no longer accept losing control. Not sometimes, not occasionally, not ever. Because the moment you decide that, everything changes. You stop reacting. You stop drifting. You stop losing. And from that point forward, You don't need to chase winning anymore, because you have removed the things that were making you lose. And when you remove enough of what makes you lose, winning becomes inevitable. Not by luck, not by chance, but by design. And that is what it means to train your mind to win in every situation.